So this is our introduction to photo photography class. Thank everybody for showing up that has, and everybody who's watching at home. Glad you're joining us too. So before we get started, just have you guys ask any questions you might have, stuff you want me to cover. So is there anything you want me to talk about next?
My pictures always end up really dark. And I use all the autofocus features and I'm thinking that I'm getting it right, and then when I get them, when I import them onto my computer, they're always really dark.
Okay. Alright, so that's one of the things we're going to address today is the exposure issue, and we'll actually specifically more address that with your type of camera you got in lesson 3, I believe it is. So, but yeah, that's an exposure issue, and we'll cover that as we go. So, anything else?
Not yet.
Okay. All right. Well, first of all, I'll start out with a little bit of a presentation we put together here. If it wants to come up. Okay. So, why is it that people enjoy photography? What are some of the reasons that people like to get involved with taking pictures and whatnot? Anybody have any clue?
One thing that comes to my mind is people love to be able to share what they're doing with their family and friends who are distant, and so with digital photography and the internet, being able to share really well, and people like to be able to take pictures for that reason, I've found.
Right. Yeah, definitely true. Definitely falls under one of the categories we're going to talk about here. So, anything else that comes to mind?
Just, I mean, to go along with that, like sharing with your family, but just keeping memories for yourself. Like, I mean, you're only gonna, excuse me, like probably be in that place once in your life, or only have a child that's 3 years old, you know, once in their lives, and so just keeping memories and remembering and stuff. So.
Definitely. They're both very good. I've narrowed it down to a few things here. One of the things that comes to mind for me is that photography is both a science and an art form. It kind of appeals to both types of personalities. You know, you've got the technical type of people that like to learn how to use the cameras and get the settings on just right to do certain things. And then you've got the more artistic people that like to do things in a creative way. And that photography appeals to people because of that as well. And the second thing, photography can invoke emotion. And what I mean from that is something kind of like you guys were saying, like memories from prior experiences that you may have had. And people in particular like to have pictures of people they know, pets, children, you know, things like that. And those types of pictures tend to evoke emotion with people. All right, so next. All right, photography can also be used to convey a message. And you know, you quite often see pictures used to promote some sort of cause, you know, like an endangered species out in Africa or something like that. And photography is very effective at doing that type of thing because, you know, a picture can convey a message a lot more stronger than words. You know, they always say a picture is worth 1,000 words, and that's definitely true. And the last one, the photo can tell a story. In particular, things like weddings and things like that. You can take pictures to tell a story of something that may have happened and create memories of those experiences. Okay? All right, so we're going to cover a couple different types of cameras. We're first of all going to talk about point and shoot a little bit, and we're also going to cover this SLR, or single lens reflex. I'm going to focus mostly on the SLR for a little while, just because the principles that we apply to the SLR can be carried down to the little point and shoot cameras. So once you understand how the big SLRs work, you can make better use of your little point and shoot camera. Okay. There are several major parts of the camera, and I'm actually going to disassemble this one a little bit here to use an example. The first thing we've got is the lens. And this is what takes all the light coming in and focuses it into the camera on either a film sensor or on film or a digital sensor. Besides the lens, there is also a shutter, and give me 1 second here and I'll actually open up the shutter, doctor the camera a bit here. Okay. Let you guys see what happens when you actually take a picture. Okay. Alright, go into manual mode. Okay, when I press the button, you can actually see the shutter open up all the way. And when you're taking a picture, it actually opens up so that light passes all the way through directly onto the film. Okay. All right, and also, as part of the camera, you've got the film or the sensor. In the digital camera, you've got a sensor, and then for the film, you've obviously got the film that gets loaded into the back there. And that's actually how the pictures get exposed. And then on an SLR in particular, you also have a viewfinder where you can look at the picture that you're composing. Does anybody have any questions so far? No? Okay. All right, so we'll cover some of this stuff in more detail as we go on. But let's see, move on. I'll show you what happens with inside of an SLR camera, because this is kind of interesting. All right, in this diagram here, you see the image, the light from the image you're taking coming in from the left. And it goes through all the different lenses, and then the yellow thing there, that's actually the mirror. When you're just composing your picture before you take it, the mirror is in the down position like that. And that bounces the light up through the viewfinder. You can see in the red line. And when the mirror is in the down position, you can see that some of it passes, some of the light passes through and bounces onto another mirror and down to the bottom. And that's how the camera is able to do autofocusing and able to register the exposure. So that's while you're composing the picture, and then once you press the button to take the picture, the mirror moves up out of the way, the shutter opens, that exposes the film or the sensor. So that's kind of a little bit about the mechanics going on inside the camera. Of course, there's a lot more going on involved with electronics and whatnot, but that's the mechanics that make a camera work. And that's how the SLRs have worked for a long time. Just over the last several years, we've automated the process a little bit. Okay? All right. Okay. And to me, there's several different major elements to photography. You've got subject, composition, and exposure, and we'll talk about each one of these in some detail. But first of all, I want to talk about subject. What are some of the subjects that people take pictures of?
Landscape.
Landscape's a good one. Yeah, like.
Probably the primary one is other people.
Yeah, most often snapshots and that type of thing. Yeah. Anything else comes to mind?
You can have pictures of like maybe a texture or something interesting. I don't know, like a texture with color.
Yeah, something artistic.
Yeah, something artistic.
Yeah, and taking pictures for the sake of art. Yeah, definitely so. I just got a couple examples here of things. Well, this is a picture you might see from somewhere else, but also got. After these first two, we've got a couple pictures of things that you might not normally take pictures of, but because of the way the pictures are shot, they're actually more interesting. And this way you can kind of call attention to things that people might not normally pay attention to. So, you know, it's got this flagpole. Might not normally look at one like that, but it's kind of interesting. And then, that's an audio mixer, and that's a view that makes it a little more interesting than just staring at a bunch of knobs. So. Now, to me, photography can be used to call attention to things in a new way, and often we choose subjects for pictures that we might not normally, just to call attention to those things. Okay, let's see. The next thing that we want to cover a little bit is going to be photo composition. That's actually going to be the focus of the next class. We're going to be covering things like rule of thirds and depth of field and things like that in order to make them more appealing to your eye. Here in particular is a picture that definitely uses the rule of thirds and what I like to call nose room in order to make the composition a little more interesting. Whereas most people might take this picture and put this girl right smack dab in the middle. I chose to put her on the left side there, and it definitely makes the picture more interesting, at least to me. So. And then we've also got another picture here that uses the rule of thirds, whereas you got the sky in the upper third and the water on the lower 2/3. So, where, like I say, most people would tend to put the subject in the middle, and that's not always necessarily the best thing to do. And so, we'll talk about composition a little bit more in the next class. The major focus of tonight, though, is going to be exposure, getting the proper exposure out of your camera. And there are 4 different types of elements to getting exposure done properly. First of all, you've got your lighting. If you're taking pictures outside, your primary light source is obviously going to be the sun. If you're taking pictures indoors, you probably have overhead lights or lamps in the room. If you've got a flash on your camera, that's obviously a pretty significant source of light. And then the one that often gets neglected, that I really love, is the reflector. When I'm taking pictures, I love to have a big reflector. And the reason I do that is because the difference between amateur photography and professional photography is lighting. And so control of lighting is everything in photography. So that's why I wanted to put exposure first, and the first thing that we talked about was because lighting really is everything as far as taking pictures. Always the difference between a pro and an amateur photo is your lighting. And there are several different things you use to control lighting on your camera. First of all is the aperture. This is in the lens. I wish I had a lens to pass around, but I don't. But there's these blades inside the lens that actually open and close in order to let more or less light into the camera. And obviously the bigger the hole, the more the light comes in. And controlling the size of the aperture also allows you to control what's called the depth of field. And like I said, we'll cover that in a lot more detail later, but for now suffice it to say that the depth of field is the range of distance away from the camera where objects are clearly in focus. So if you've got a shallow depth of field, you have a very short distance away from the camera, a very small distance away from the camera that's in focus. And a large depth of field, you might have everything in focus. So we'll cover that a lot more later. And here's just one example of shallow depth of field, where you can clearly see that the word depth of field is in focus, whereas everything in front and behind is blurred. So we'll learn to use this creatively as we talk more about taking pictures. Okay. Going back to aperture, the aperture is defined in terms of an F number. And you've probably seen on the lens little marking of range of numbers. You won't be able to see that on camera, but in this lens it's 3.5 to 4.5, and that's a measure of the largest size that the aperture can be. And that seems a little counterintuitive, that a small number is a bigger opening, but that in fact is the way that f-stop works. It's a ratio, so if you consider that you're dividing a number by the f number, it makes a little more sense as to the size of the opening. Smaller number equals a bigger aperture, which lets more light in. A bigger number is a smaller aperture and lets less light in. And the reason that you would want to adjust that is because when you have a shallow depth of field from using a big aperture, you have your main subject in focus and everything else is blurred, so it really calls attention to the subject that you're taking a picture of. Whereas if you go with a small aperture, you're going to have everything in focus, so you're calling attention to a much wider range of things. Does that make sense to everybody? I know the f-stop is kind of a difficult concept to grasp at first, just because small number equals bigger hole equals more light. So if you just remember, so here we go. So for example, we got 1.8 is a larger aperture, lets more light in, and f5.6 is a smaller aperture and lets less light in. The key here is the slash, which you think of that as a divisor. It's dividing a number by the f number on the film. And that is how you can remember how much light is going to be coming through based on the f-stop. Okay? All right. Here's just another visual example of how the different sizes of f-stops might be represented, where you have f1.4, f2, all the way to f8 in a ratio.
So does the camera automatically, like if you have it in the auto mode, does it automatically move that f-stop?
It does. Most of the time, most cameras will generally go somewhere in the middle, so that you can kind of get a balance between having the small aperture, large depth of field, and the large aperture, shallow depth of field. So, especially on point and shoots, they're going to really try and shoot for something in the middle. Another thing I probably ought to mention is these small little point and shoots like this, because they have such small lenses on them, they've got really, really small apertures, and they leave a lot of things in focus. That actually makes it easier for the camera to focus because it doesn't have to work as hard to do it. So that's one of the ways they cheat on the little consumer cameras, is they'll do the little lenses. And it's actually cheaper to build them that way too. And then we'll just look at another chart of some of the, I don't know if you can read that or not, but that's a chart of the common F numbers. So you see the green, those are the most common F numbers that you'll find on lenses, with some other number appearing in between. So that's, and actually if you're going to buy an SLR camera, that's one of the things you want to look at. It's like, what's the largest aperture that this lens will give me? Because the more light you let in with the bigger aperture, the shorter your shutter time is, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But and then you also were able to limit the size of the depth of field, and that's very appealing in photography, because when you're taking a picture, you typically don't want to have a distracting background behind your subject. So a lot of times it's really good to have a large aperture, small f number, when you're taking a picture as best you can, within the limits of your film and or digital sensor and the shutter speeds that your camera happens to offer.
So what's better, a wider range or lower numbers?
I like to have lower numbers personally, just because gives you that flexibility, and that's actually what drives the cost of lenses up the most. The most expensive lenses are the ones that have the smallest f number, the largest apertures on them. You see those big old lenses that they use at sporting events and things like that, they might have an f number of like 2.8 or maybe even lower, and those big lenses will cost like $5,000, $6,000, $7,000 easily, and it's because of the large aperture that they're so expensive.
So it's one of the larger aperture that makes it so there's less in focus.
Yes,
okay.
Exactly, yeah. And that's the primary reason that we use the large aperture when we're taking pictures, is so that we can have less in focus.
Okay.
It means you have to be a lot more careful when you're doing focus, but it gives a much more appealing picture. Let me see if I got an example here of some depth of field. Let's see, I did that one. Here is an example of a picture with a large aperture, shallow depth of field. You can see how even within the flower itself, the things that are further away are out of focus, and the close parts are in focus. And then we'll view with an aperture of f32. The first one was f5, this one's f32. So you can see that a lot more is in focus here, and the background isn't thrown out of focus quite as much. So the first picture definitely calls your attention more to the flowers than this one does. So, does it make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Let's see. What else?
For the first time ever.
I never understood that.
Okay. Yeah. It's it. Here we go. Here's another picture with a very, very shallow depth of field. You can see where the cat's face is in focus, and then everything else is thrown out of focus. And this picture was probably taken with something like an f2.8 or larger. Along those lines, while I'm talking about this, mention that when people talk about lenses, they'll quite often refer to them as fast and slow. And then what a fast lens is it means that it's got a bigger aperture, and so it lets more light in, so you don't have to open your shutter as long. Basically, it's saying, I'm able to take the picture faster because more light is entering the camera. So if someone says I have a fast lens, that's what they mean. It means it's got a large aperture.
That tends to have a blur lens if you move it, right? If it takes it faster, it's like less blurry.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah. Well, there's something else we're going to cover here in a minute. It's shutter speed and whatnot. But let's see. I lost my place here. Okay. Okay. One thing that we probably ought to mention is that most point-and-shoot cameras like this don't have a way to manually control the f number, the aperture on the camera. I say direct because there are ways you can trick the camera into using a shallow depth of field, a larger aperture, and then there's ways to make it use a smaller aperture. That's something we're going to cover in lesson 3 when we talk more about how to get the most out of a point-and-shoot camera. But one of the reasons that people go to the SLR style cameras is because you have direct control of that. In fact, these cameras, you probably won't be able to see this, but I've got a mode on here. It's called AV. And that's a mode for setting. You actually set the aperture that you want, and the camera figures out everything else for you. So you say I want an aperture of 2.8, f2.8, and then the camera figures out everything else in order to give it the proper exposure.
Camera, do most SLRs do that?
Yes,
or?
well,
Like even if because I've got like an older, I mean it's not super old, but it's older than that, and it's not like really automatic. So for that sense, would I have to like do things?
If it's a fully automatic camera, well, if it's a fully manual camera, you'll have to do it yourself.
Oh, okay.
It's probably all manual, but most of the SLR style cameras that have been made in, let's say, the last 25 years or so.
It's my dad's.
Yeah, it could be. So most of the ones that have been made in the last 25 years will have a setting on there that we can specify the aperture that you want. So, yeah, yeah, there you go. So the old film cameras require manual control of aperture. It wasn't until mid 80s or so that they actually had it. And the reason for that is because in order to control the size of the aperture, you actually mechanically have to move something, and the older cameras didn't have the power in order to make that move inside. So, any other questions? No? Okay, let's see, what else have we got here? Okay, so we're going to move on to shutter speed. We got aperture, which is how much light comes through the lens, and then we'll move on to the shutter speed. And I showed you the shutter in the camera, and the shutter speed is referring to how long that shutter stays open in order to expose the film or the digital sensor. And it's referred to in fractions of a second. So if you're on your camera, it says 30. That actually means it's going to be open for 1/30th of a second, and that's going to be a slow exposure, and that would be one that would be likely to blur if you're hand holding it. And then you can go up to, say, 4,000, which is 1/4000th of a second. You'd probably only take pictures like that in the sun, but that tends to freeze motion. And another interesting thing about that is that having a fast shutter tends to convey a feeling of urgency and energy more so than a picture taken. Where are we going? Okay, I take that back. This is the slow one. It should be. I should use this example. Okay, yeah, there you go. This is the one with the fast shutter speed. You can see that it feels like it has a lot more energy to it. The fast shutter has captured things and kept them still. It freezes motion. A slower shutter speed can kind of calm things down a little bit. So go back to the previous one. So that's a little more calm, a little less energetic, a little more serene. So on SLR cameras like this, it has a TV setting where you specify the shutter speed, and then it figures out the aperture for you, doesn't it? So it comes up with the proper combination in order to get the proper exposure.
Why is it called TV?
My theory is time value, and the other one's aperture value, but the manual doesn't really say. You're left to guess. And I think other manufacturers will use different symbols, but they all have these same modes on them. So while I'm mentioning that, the camera also has an M setting, which is fully manual, where you specify the aperture and the shutter speed, both. And the camera will let you do a bad exposure if you do that. You can even expose it too short and have a dark picture, or expose too long and have something that's blown out. So.
But there are times when you want that.
Yeah, there are times, yeah. Yeah, and for the sake of creativity or whatnot. And the other thing is, like, sometimes the camera is just not sure the proper way to expose something. Like if you're taking a picture in the snow or on the beach, it tends to underexpose because there's so much white in the picture. Or if you're trying to take a picture at night, it tends to overexpose a little bit. Things get blown out. Things that, like if you have a flash, things will get blown out very easily when you're taking pictures at night. So the camera doesn't always guess. It's complete guessing. In fact, let me grab my light meter here. A lot of professional photographers, instead of relying on the camera to tell them what exposure to use, they use a light meter like this. And the way you use this, you turn it on and you actually hold it near the subject that you're taking a picture of, and you press the button and it tells you the proper exposure right there on the screen. And you can adjust it for different size apertures, different f-stops. And then on the left here it shows you the proper shutter speed to get the right exposure. So not something everybody needs, especially with newer cameras, because they're getting a lot better about that. And especially because most cameras have the ability to shift in what they call shift in exposure. Like if you're taking a picture in the snow and you want it to expose properly, you can actually manually tell the camera to expose a little bit more. On this camera, you do it just by rotating the little wheel, and on this one, you do it in the menu. If we got a little bit of time here, a little later on, I'll hook these up and actually show you on the screen how all that works. So, everybody following? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right.
Do you ever do non-digital?
Not much anymore.
In the pictures and all that?
I don't use film much anymore. This is my film camera over here, and I've used that to shoot probably maybe a dozen rolls of film since I got it in 5 years ago, and it's mostly been slides when someone has to put a very high resolution picture up on projection or something like that. And slides are actually the clearest pictures you can take, because the way it works is when you're taking a slide film or a slide picture, you're exposing the actual slide itself, and when you're doing prints, you expose the negative, and then the negative is transferred onto a print, so it loses something in the process. So purist photographers like to shoot on slides, and just because you can get the best picture with that. But personally, I don't use film much anymore, and because the modern digital cameras have gotten so good. So I still keep it around just in case, and it wouldn't be worth anything if I tried to sell it anyway. So the interesting thing though is if you take a photography class at a school, they'll start you out on a film camera before they even talk about digital. They say go buy one, and in fact they like you to use the manually controlled cameras as much as possible, because you really do learn how photography works if you're doing it that way instead of relying on the digital to automate everything for you. So, and to be honest, today film still has a better image than digital. So digital's mostly for convenience. So yeah. Anything else before we move on?
Rob had a question.
Oh.
He texted to me.
He didn't email it to me, did he? No, he didn't. Okay.
He might, yeah.
Okay.
He asked if the aperture pictures look like that in the camera or only after the picture's taken. So will the camera emulate the aperture or not?
Depends on the camera. On this one in particular, there's a button right over here on the side. That's called the depth of field preview. And what this does is it actually closes the shutter, or the aperture down to the size when you're actually taking the picture, so you can see what it really looks like. Otherwise, it opens the aperture all the way as you're composing the picture to let the most light in. Otherwise, your viewfinder might get dark. So, yeah, if your camera has a depth of field preview on it, then you can see what it'll really look like when you shoot it. Otherwise, it's going to be what you're seeing is what it looks like with the largest aperture. So, yeah, that is a good question. So. Any other questions? All right, let's see.
No more text messages.
No more text messages. You can IM it, Rob. I do have it open. Okay, let's see. Where is I at? Okay. All right. And the last thing that we need to talk about with regard to exposure is it's called ISO, and it's really hard to see in this picture. But back in the days of film, they had different films with different levels of sensitivity to light. You had a fast film, which like an ISO 1600, where you don't have to open the shutter as long, you don't have to open up the aperture as much in order to let the proper amount of light in. And the way that they accomplish that is by using larger grains, silver grains, on the film itself. And what that results in is a very grainy picture. And I don't know if you can see on the bottom picture here, but it's a little more grainy than the one on the top, and the reason for that is they chose a fast film to take that picture. The one on the top is a slower film, say maybe something like an ISO 200 or 100, something like that. And when you're shooting film, you have to decide ahead of time what film or what ISO you're going to be shooting with. You actually buy a film, let's say an ISO 100, an ISO 400, or 100 speed or 400 speed. It's actually the way most people refer to it. Yeah, and those are just different levels of sensitivity. And with a lot of digital cameras these days, you can actually adjust the sensitivity of the digital sensor in there. You'll have a menu option where you can change the ISO setting. Let me hook up my little tiny guy here. This is a pretty typical little point-and-shoot digital. I don't use it a whole lot, but Let's see if I can find this one. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so I'll go into the menu. There you go, ISO sensitivity. So here's what I was talking about. It defaults to auto. The camera decides what your ISO is going to be. And who knows how it does it. It's just kind of arbitrary. Every manufacturer does something a little bit different. So quite often when you're taking pictures, you want to set that manually. Say, if you want to have a picture that blurs a lot in the background, you want to go with a smaller ISO number, a less sensitive film. And then use your large aperture, and that'll give you the look that you want. So it's the combination of the aperture size, the shutter speed, and the ISO that gives you the proper exposure. I probably should have said that earlier, but it's a combination of those three things that actually lets you get the proper exposure on your camera. And so if you have the option to choose any of those things, it gives you a lot more flexibility. This camera doesn't let me choose the shutter speed or the aperture, but it does let me choose the ISO. So I'd have a little bit of flexibility there. You can tweak your pictures a little bit based on that.
Is there any way you can change the, like if there's a delay and you press it and what it takes?
No, that's an inherent feature in the camera, or lack of feature in the camera, I should say. That's one of those things where the more expensive the camera, the faster it's going to be. Like with a digital SLR, as soon as you press that shutter, it actually takes the picture. So, you know, there's no delay on that. Whereas on this one, you press the button, wait for half a second, and then it gets the picture, and you've probably missed what you wanted to get in the first place.
Yeah.
So,
You just have to learn to pre-focus them. You like push it softly and get it to focus, and then it's pretty quick after that.
yeah, that's the thing. Like most of the time, if you just mash down the button, it takes a little while for it to focus before it takes the picture. So, if you can pre-focus, that helps a lot. But sometimes we don't have that option.
So film, the only place I've ever heard of film speed is like, we used to like sneak cameras into concerts, and you always wanted to use like 1,000.
Right.
Why is that? I'm trying to sort that
because
out in my head.
a high-speed film like a 1000 is a lot more sensitive to light than, say, a 100 speed film. So you don't need to have the shutter open as long. You don't need to have as big an aperture. And in case of something like a concert, it's just dark. And so having the faster film allows you to get the light to the film, enough light to the film in a short period of time without having to leave the shutter open for 30 seconds or something ridiculous.
So with the fast enough, would it take the place of a flash to an extent? Or?
To some degree. I mean, the flash is obviously a light source, so it's going to make things look a little bit different, as if, you know, like you're holding a flashlight on somebody. A higher speed film just uses whatever light happens to exist there already. So.
Now, if you pick a different speed of film, wouldn't that affect like the automatic features in the camera? So they'd have to actually take that into account.
It does. Yeah, it definitely does. In fact, back in the days of these cameras, they came with a system called DX, and there's these little tiny pins in there. I don't know if you can see those there or not, but those actually read a code on the canister of film to tell the camera what speed it is, so then it knows the proper way to expose based on the sensitivity of the film. With digital cameras, you actually set it on the camera, and so obviously it knows, and you can use it that way. So most of the time, I like to shoot with as slow as I can get away with, slow and ISO as I can get away with, say 100 or 200, just because the pictures come out clear. You can see from this example again, like it's just, everything is that much more clear and a lot less noise. Another advantage to that is if you're shooting digital, that actually makes the files smaller because it doesn't have to use as much data to record that noise. So your file sizes are considerably smaller if you shoot with a low ISO.
Another question.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned with old film,
Mm-hmm.
regular film, that the silver crystals were larger. Mm-hmm. With digital, obviously there's not that. So why is it grainier in digital also?
Because basically what's happening with the ISO in a digital camera is that it's using whatever light is there and it's amplifying it. And when you amplify that light, you also get noise. So if you're going with a high ISO setting like 1600 or something like that, you're not only amplifying the light that's coming into the camera, you're amplifying the noise that's just inherent within the digital sensor itself. So you get a noisier picture just because of that. It's a different kind of noise than you get from film. Some people like the film grain look. In fact, movie makers like to have a little bit of grain added to their images just because it adds a certain something to it. But digital noise is generally not very pleasing and not very desirable. So the only times I ever go to like an ISO 1600 or something like that is if there just isn't enough light and my flash isn't going to work or whatever. So.
You said it's clearer though when you have it slower?
Yeah, the slower.
But if you move it, then it'll be blurry, right? If
Right.
You don't like hold it.
Yeah. The longer the shutter is open, in order to let more light in, the more likely it is to blur. Think of it if you're moving a camera, you're panning it across, and you got a slow shutter speed, you're going to get a whole heck of a lot of the scenery exposed. Whereas with the faster film, you'll be able to capture the image better. So, yeah. Any question? Let's see what I got here. That's actually the bulk of everything that I had prepared for tonight. Like next week we're going to be talking primarily about photo composition. So we're going to talk about how to get the best picture as far as framing and location of the camera and zoom and things like that, and what you can do in order to get a more appealing picture. So yeah, so be prepared to ask questions about that next week. So afterwards, I'll be happy to go through settings on anybody's cameras to show you how to adjust things as best we can. But any other questions before we wrap up? No?
Good work, man.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks for coming.